Hello, I'm Alistair McIntyre. I'm the web publisher of Electric Scotland, and today I wanted to raise the topic of slavery. It's just that I've become interested for a number of reasons. For example, many years ago there was that series on television, I think it was called Roots, where was it someone like, was it Haley or someone like that, who was an African American who wanted to trace his roots back to Africa if he could, and the whole series was about that. I was fascinated with that program, really enjoyed viewing it. But my job really is to tell the history of Scotland and the Scots, both at home and abroad. And so over many years now, I've been digging to find out more about how people lived in the old days. And in the 18th century, the whole of the 18th century, the 1700s, I've been digging in to try and get an idea of how people lived back in those days. And obviously when people write history, they talk about the people. But they don't talk about any individual people. What they talk about are the generals, the lords, the chiefs of clans, and so forth, the important people. They don't really dwell on the real people, the actual people. So when you do come across accounts, they start to give you a little touch and feel for how people lived in the old days. And the way they lived in the old days was not particularly pleasant. Although I suspect that as that was the normal way they lived, that they didn't know anything different, and that was just accepted as the normal way of living. I mean, for example, a lot of the little houses they had, I mean, half of it was maybe devoted to the livestock. So, you know, in the winter, the cattle or the sheep might actually be in the other half of the house, being protected from the environment. And so often the other half was just a great big room with a peat fire in the middle. So it was a kind of tough life. But also the chiefs and the lords would appoint tacksmen. And they were ones that basically had charge of chunks of land on which there were many small settlements and small individual farms and crofts. And it was their job to get the rent. And as you dig into that, you often find that some people that had a little croft, because they hadn't really any money, instead of paying rent, they had to give 100 days to the tacksman to do whatever he asked them to do. In some respects, that was a form of slavery. And remember, in these old days, the power of the clan chief was based on how many men he could bring to arms to fight for whatever he wanted them to fight for. So I suppose in those old days, that's why you talk about any of the clansmen could talk to the chief. Because from the chief's interest to make sure that he looked after his people to a degree so they would fight for him. But as I say, as you examine these things, you come across all kinds of accounts. For example, there was a small town called Auchterarder. This is in northern Perthshire. Now, in this Jacobite rebellion period, there was two big wars of the Jacobites, one in 1715, the other in 1745. And at this particular period, the Jacobites decided that because the king's troops were getting so near, that they had to waste the land so that there would be no protection for the king's troops, or there would be no grain to feed the horses. So they burnt the houses and they burnt the crops. But you'd think with this new Stuart king wanting to become the king of the whole of Great Britain, that he would have done something to look after the people. So having made the decision to waste the lands, you think he would have given sufficient warning to all the people living there to gather their goods together and possessions together, and they would be transported to somewhere else where they would at least have shelter and safe harbour, as it were. But that wasn't the case. Quite often the first you knew about your house going to be burnt was someone chapping at the door saying, "You got 5 minutes to get out and we're burning your house." And of course naturally there was protests, but as they were protesting the 5 minutes was up and the house was put on fire. So the people inside had no option but to dash out the house, grab whatever they could on the way out, but often they were coming out in the clothes they were stood up in the house. And this was all done, I might add, in the middle of a very severe snowstorm. Now, I suppose if you're given orders to do that, fair enough, but then what you find is anyone that did manage to take out any possessions, the clansmen that were there stole those possessions from them. So it ended up all they had were the clothes they stood up on, and even some of these clansmen stole their clothes. And they were almost half naked in these horrible weather conditions. And one can't imagine that itself was ordered by the generals that were destroying the village. They did it themselves. So this is a really bad period in Scottish history. But the reason I started to look at the slavery issue was that I also found out that after the 1745 rebellion, there were tens of thousands of prisoners taken. And they were taken first down, I think, mostly to northern England. But from there, they were sold as indentured servants and slaves, in effect, to plantations in Virginia and the other states in America. So Scotland had its own share in the slavery of their own people. So it wasn't just a black African slavery, there was white Scottish slavery as well. But then I thought to myself, well, where did they send them? I mean, one can imagine they sold them to British plantation owners. I mean, maybe they sold them to German or Dutch plantation owners. I don't actually know. I'm still researching this. But one also has to imagine that there must have been some Scottish plantation owners. In fact, I know of a few Scottish plantation owners, only I know absolutely nothing about them. It's just a reference in a wider document. So I was trying to find out what condition the slaves lived under. Because as I remembered watching that Roots series, while there was some real brutality going on, I would submit that there was equal brutality of a similar, if not even worse nature going on in Scotland at the time, to people who were ostensibly free. So I was trying to understand it, because after the 1745 rebellion, that broke the back of Scottish clans. There was no value now in the clan chief being able to call people to arms, because there's no way he could use them. And you hear of the Highland clearances in Scotland, where basically a lot of these clan chiefs cleared the land to put sheep on it. And again, if you look at the way they treated those people, I think they were given some notice that they had to vacate. But if they didn't vacate by a certain date, again, the house was raised around them, and they were just turfed out. And only a very few clan chiefs actually bothered to try to help their people. And I also have to say that sometimes the local people didn't help themselves. I mean, for example, I was reading a very good article on how someone thought a croft of just 5 acres could not only feed the entire family well for the year, but give them a surplus that not only would allow them to pay the rent, but to actually give them some cash money. And the paper that was written about that was highly critical of the lords that owned the land, because they said if they'd invested some effort into showing the people how to run their lands better, then not only would the lords have actually got more of an income, but they'd have had a happy bunch of people. But instead they just turfed them on and replaced them with sheep. And of course a lot of these Scots that left, and a lot of them were the tacksmen as well. The tacksmen were usually the ones that had money. A lot of them emigrated to America and obviously bought ranches and lands and so forth in America. So I was kind of interested in the conditions that the slaves were held under. Because from what I remember of that Roots thing, there was like barracks almost that they lived in, but it seemed to me they had shelter and they had food at the very least. Whereas in the Highlands, a lot of people were starving to death, quite literally, not enough food. In fact, there's a comment in one of the histories that the English were saying, in England we feed our horses oats, but in Scotland they feed the people oats. Well, of course, today we know that oats are actually very good for you, so that wasn't bad at all, but nevertheless, that was the commentary. We feed the horses oats here in England, and in Scotland they feed oats to the people. So it's a question really in my mind of, were all the slaveholders necessarily brutal, or were they in fact continuing something that they'd already had happening back in Scotland? Because whereas a lot of the people might have had a wee plots of land, it seemed to me that there was also some land for a kitchen garden for the slaves as well that they could tend. And I sometimes wonder, because the people that left Scotland obviously had lived for generations in a clan system. And I wonder somehow if they took that kind of clan philosophy with them. And so when they had slaves, they saw them as being part of, in quotes, their clan. But you know, there really is, at least I can find nothing really about, I mean, all you really learn is the brutality of the slave owner. But I started to wonder if in fact they weren't brutal. I mean, they were brutal when you look at it from today, the way we live today. But were they brutal in the way that they lived back in the 1700s? Or were they just continuing what was happening anyway? And so I was trying to find, maybe I could find an account of a Scottish slave owner that might have mentioned something about his life and how he treated his slaves and so forth, because I wanted to try to do a comparison between how he ran his estate, as it were, as opposed to how he would have run it in Scotland at the same period of time. And so that was just, this was the purpose of me doing this small video, because I suppose at one hand I wanted to say that today we feel that slavery was just terrible, and I mean, and I, by the way, entirely agree there shouldn't be any slavery at all. That's make that absolutely clear. But I just wanted to compare how a slave owner might have looked after the slaves in these days, as opposed to how they looked after the equivalent people in Scotland at the same period in time. And at the moment I can't find that information, because I'm quite sure, like for example, when you look at the clearances in Scotland, the Sutherland family that owned that area of Scotland do come over as the most brutal and heartless people you could ever wish to imagine. I mean, they might have actually come up to their estates every 5 years for a visit, but on the whole they lived in luxury in London. It could be argued that they weren't particularly aware of how the people were treated, and they were treated most brutally. I mean, they looked after sheep and cattle better than they looked after the people in that area. That was a horrendous place to live during those Highland clearances. It was just terrible. So I wanted to try to compare how the slave owners ran their land and system that they ran, as opposed to how people lived in Scotland. I mean, you hear stories that when they were turfed out, they would scavenge on the beach, big driftwood, to make a little semi-shelter for themselves. They would get fish and get shellfish, but I mean, there's only so much of that available. So I don't know. I would really like to get a better handle on how the slave system worked in especially in the southern states, and try to compare how the slaves were looked after as opposed to how the Scots were looked after that same period in Scotland. So that was my reason for doing the video, was to kind of explain a little bit of the background, and at the same time put a plea out there that, does anyone know of any reasonably factual accounts of how the slave owning process worked back in these days, and especially if we can find a Scot that was also a slave owner, because I really would like to compare the treatment of the slaves against how they treated the people back in Scotland. So there you go. That was my reason for doing this wee video about slavery, and I hope anyone that might view it might get in touch if they have some information. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for listening.